This series of talks, An American Spirituality for the 80s, was recorded live by St. Anthony Messenger Press. The speaker is Father James J. Basic.
A contemporary spirituality is going to have to be prophetic if it's going to be believable in today's world. By prophetic, I mean concerned with the matters of social justice. As we become more and more aware in our modern world of the evils existing in societies, the inequities, the way people are suffering throughout our world, political prisoners, people starving to death, and so on, we simply cannot ignore all of that as Christian people. The needs are too pressing. The suffering is too intense. We are too much aware of it through the modern media to just leave it aside and to pretend as though our Christian faith says nothing about it or calls us to do nothing to try to alleviate that suffering. All of that is a mistake. Instead, our spirituality has to have this prophetic dimension, this concern with social justice. Now, unfortunately, very often, very good religious people don't see that. They don't understand the social dimension of the gospel. They want to confine Christianity to the church. They want it to be concerned simply with what goes on Sundays. They want a message spoken just that concerns the inner life or the life of prayer. I know I find out in my own experience that when I preach sermons on social justice themes that I get a good deal of flack over those usually. People are often upset by them. Some of the harshest comments I've ever gotten come after those kinds of sermons. I remember one man coming up to me after I preached about John the Baptist and his prophetic role and how that called upon us to be modern prophets and fighting social injustice. Came up to me and looked at me and says, "You are a disgrace to the cloth." Feeling that I had betrayed my priestly ministry, that my job was to preach the message of personal love and inner piety and the life of prayer and meditation, and that I had no business speaking about these larger questions of social justice and suggesting that we should do something about them. I can remember times when people would come up after sermons like that just terribly upset and say that I had no right to talk like that, and that if you want to talk like that, become a politician and don't masquerade as a priest. Take that collar off if you want to talk like that. And so very often, it's not just a matter of a perception that Christianity needs to be limited to the church and to the sacristy, but a really strong emotional reaction against the suggestion of social involvement. I attended the Charismatic Convention in Notre Dame back a couple years ago, and it was right after Cardinal Sunens had made a general call for charismatics to be very immersed and concerned with the social apostolate. And it was a rather well-publicized kind of remark. And during that whole conference at Notre Dame, I never heard one speaker refer to it. I never heard one person get up and say, yes, we have to listen to the advice of Cardinal Sunens, who is, in some ways, the leader of this whole charismatic movement. That just seemed to be set aside, as all of the talk was about personal piety and receiving the gifts of the Holy Spirit. Now, of course, all of that is good, and the growth of the spiritual life, the gifts of the Spirit, but surely it has to be tied to this other social dimension of the gospel. And I think it was rather disappointing that theme did not emerge at that conference. Now, I must say, since then, I see signs that people in the modern evangelical movement are more aware of that. I remember listening to a tape of a woman very much connected with the evangelical movement, in which she was suggesting that there was a need to be more socially aware on the part of evangelicals, that they had to join in the search and the struggle for social justice. I think that magazine Sojourners takes up that line of thought, trying to link the evangelical revival with the social apostolate. But those seem to be exceptions because we still have so many people who simply refuse to entertain that idea at all. Now, it could be that that is a result of a general feeling here in the United States, a cultural sense which goes with the notion of rugged individualism. That's been part of our heritage as Americans, that of self-reliance as an individual. Emerson enunciated that theme for us. We shouldn't be dependent upon others. We should pick ourselves up by our own bootstraps. That's become the watchword. We have the feeling in our culture that all these people on welfare, for example, are somehow chiselers and riding around in big cars. There's a tremendous lack of understanding of the welfare system in the United States. I don't think anybody these days wants to say it's a great system or that it runs in perfect shape or order. But the notion that high percentages of people are on welfare who are able-bodied and could find jobs and work simply is not true. So often it is dependent children or people over 65 or the blind or people who can't work in one way or another who are receiving the welfare help. And so one of the things that it would seem we need to do in the United States is to break through that kind of mythology, that false understanding of what is going on in our country. But this rugged individualism seems to be part of our national psyche. The cowboy remains a hero. The Marlboro Cigarette Company found that out by putting a man on a horse and putting a tattoo on him. They began to sell a lot of cigarettes. It was one of the most successful advertising campaigns in history because it taps something that's important in the American mentality. The celebration of this man who has no ties, who's off by himself, who's not dependent upon anybody else, who can ride out into the sunset after doing whatever he is called upon to do. That epitomizes this rugged individualism. You take care of yourself. This is in opposition to what we would call a more communal spirit that we find in other cultures where people feel a sense of responsibility for others, where people like to live close to one another, feel their dependency, and where a more genuine sense of community develops. So it could be that the cultural rugged individualism tends to make our religious problem more difficult here. I think to the question of the movements in the 1960s, which were so celebrated when the media made it seem as though many people were involved in the social causes, people working to eradicate racism, and then as the war progressed, people fighting on behalf of peace and demonstrating and marching and so on. Well, my own perception of that movement was that it was never as large as the media might have given us to think. There was really only a small group of people who were actually committed to it at any one time. So I remember an event at a peace rally on our campus where there was a lot of talk about going and sitting in the ROTC building as a symbolic protest, and people were yelling, right, yeah, let's do that. I remember a girl in front of me who was standing there saying, yeah, that's really right, I'm right with them, and you know, if I didn't have a date tonight, I'd go over there too. And somehow that sort of epitomized for me the depth of conviction that was held by many people at the time of the movements. Much of the opposition to the war, of course, was on the part of those who were worried about the draft and people who knew people who were subject to the draft. And so that sort of intensified some of it. But to what degree we really had a sense of social involvement and the need to better our world and eradicate racism and overcome war and so on, I'm not sure that it really existed. In other words, I'm not sure the 60s were much different than any other time. Of course, we've seen now in the 70s, the business that we call the me decade, and a greater privatizing tendency. It seems as though people even got tired of the limited involvement that they had. I remember asking a student of mine one time, why he was no longer involved in some of the social causes. And he looked at him and he says, "Hey man, I can't take it. It tears me up inside." Know what it means to be serious about these things? It means to be in a continual turmoil inside yourself. Tell you the truth, I just couldn't take it anymore. It tore me up too much. And certainly he spoke, I think, what many people feel who are serious about the social apostolate, and that is that it takes its toll, that people often feel drained when they are involved in this, and it becomes hard to sustain the effort. And so we have a lot of opposition to any kind of talk that Christianity needs to be concerned with the problems of injustice in our world. And it becomes important to be able to answer that. We have to know what to tell the person who tells me don't preach on social justice matters. The people who are serious about social concerns have to have a way of speaking to people who that defends their position in refuting those who want to confine Christianity to the mere to the realm of private religion and inner piety. Now, in opposition to all that, we must insist that our spirituality, if it's going to be believable to people today, has to have this prophetic dimension. It simply has to. Otherwise, people are going to say, well, what are you people about? Or you don't make any difference in the world. Don't you know that there's a harsh, bitter world out there that needs redeeming in some way? What are you doing about it? Now, as we try to work out a theology here, a systematic understanding of the prophetic dimension, we might turn first of all to the Old Testament, where the Exodus event forms such a central theme in the whole of the Hebrew Scriptures. And you have to remember what happened in the Exodus. Here we have a group of people enslaved in Egypt, and God takes them out from there. He gives them a liberation, a political and economic and social freedom. Gets them out from under the thumb of the tyrant, takes them out and gives them their own land where they enjoy liberation, where they have the opportunity to develop themselves and their own way of life. The God of the Exodus is a God who frees people in a very real, concrete, political, economic, and social way. We cannot forget that. The Old Testament has an earthiness about it, a reality. It is a good corrective to much of our heavenly kind of piety that is so prevalent today. And when we look at the New Testament, we see that kind of thing continued. We think of Jesus' own self-understanding. And when he, in the 4th chapter of Luke's Gospel, when he tries to tell what he is all about, when he describes his own mission, he turns to the words of the Old Testament. He says, "My job is to proclaim liberty to captives and to set the downtrodden free." Again, the notion of liberation. And so what are we to think of as followers of Jesus Christ? That we are to carry on that mission, that we have to be concerned about those who suffer in our world, who are imprisoned in one way or another. I think of that we really are getting this message across. Very often our spiritual leaders have been great guides on this. We have to remember how well the popes have done in our own century in speaking the message of social justice. Very often people get mad about what they say about internal church affairs, but we should not forget that other dimension. Leo XIII championing the right of the workers, the church in the United States in the 20th century, being on the side of the working man to organize into labor unions, being very supportive and helpful. Now we think of Pope John and his call for rich nations to be more helpful to the poorer ones in the world. We think of Pope Paul VI coming to the United Nations and saying, "No more war." We think of our own bishops in the United States who have made some fine statements. 1971, the Roman Synod of Catholic Bishops declared that action on behalf of justice and participation in the transformation of the world fully appear to us as a constitutive dimension of the preaching of the gospel, or in other words, of the Church's mission for the redemption of the human race and its liberation from every oppressive situation, from the document Justice in the World. Well, Well, it's important to have that kind of quote at hand because it's a statement from authority which shows that we have to have this social dimension, that it's not just something nice, not frosting on the cake or something you do later on if you happen to have time, but an essential element in the preaching of the gospel. After all, our words are going to ring hollow. They're going to be shallow unless they are accompanied by deeds, by actions. Remember the statement of one of my professors one time who says, hey, you know, there's more than one way to take the Lord's name in vain. I said, well, what is that? He says, well, that is to say it when people are not ready to hear it. And one of the reasons they're not ready to hear it is because we haven't helped them. He said another statement. He says, really, the name of the Jesus should be the P.S. at the end of a long letter of service. And I thought that has always struck me because it sounds so real. Because it's a question, therefore, when you preach the gospel, the good news, your own belief, it has a credibility when you've already helped people, when you've served them. I remember being called upon to give some talks to missionaries who were returning from around the world. And I was trying to give them an update of theology and so on, and I ended up learning so much more from those people by just listening to them recount their experiences. And I remember one sister saying something like, well, I went there thinking I would preach the gospel, and I ended up spending a lot of time trying to teach them to improve their fishing techniques and to just take care of themselves on a personal basis. First the service, first the care, alleviating suffering, and then comes the preaching of the Word or the name of the Lord Jesus. So, the God of the Scriptures is, the God of Exodus is one who frees His people, and we are called upon to share in that task. So that would be one way of getting at this message of a theological background for saying that social justice has to be our concern and part of our spirituality. There's another thesis that we might try to develop, which would be that the love of God and the love of neighbor are essentially linked. That you really cannot have one without the other. That's one of the important contributions of Jesus, is His stress on putting those two things together. Synoptic Gospels remind us that these two loves are really together the source of life. Find that in 10th chapter of Luke. They really are the fulfillment of the Old Testament, and they are the greatest commandment, the both of them together, to love God and love our neighbor. And in some ways, in our modern world, the love of neighbor has a centrality to it. It becomes the more significant element because in some ways it's visible. People can see it. When we talk about God, it can be very heavenly to people, very out of touch. They might not know what we're talking about when we say the word God and we're to love God. People might say, well, what does that mean, or how would you love God? Where, on the other hand, love of neighbor is palpable. People can point to it. It's a great thing to be able to say that we help people. What it means to us today to look at Mother Teresa, what an example that woman is. What a way in which she makes Christianity real. How many people have felt that, especially since her reception of the Nobel Peace Prize? Here's a woman who goes out into the streets and cares for the worst off of God's people. She puts the gospel into action. And that speaks to other people. That is a great witness. And then when Mother Teresa says other things about the need for prayer and love of God, then it has a credibility to it. So we need this kind of witness. And of course, we always have to go back to this statement from 1 John. Anyone who says, I love God and hates his brother is a liar, since a man who does not love the brother that he can see cannot love God, whom he has never seen. So that really becomes an age-old wisdom for us, part of our Christian tradition. Love of God and love of neighbor, they have to go together. And I think that love of neighbor needs to be at the forefront of our spirituality today. There's another theme that maybe we could try to develop, and that is the social character of sin. So often when we think of sin, it is a matter of disobeying God's law, or for people who have advanced further in their contemporary understanding, it is a failure in love, or inability to grow in life, or culpable hurting of another person, all more contemporary ways of saying it. But very often the understanding of sin remains a very private matter between me and God, or maybe me and one other person. Whereas what we need to develop today is the social dimension of sin. This has even worked its way into official documents, so it's not a strange idea. What it means is that sin has social consequences, that sin gets embedded in institutions. There are such things as unjust social structures. Many people really are caught in a hellish circle of poverty. It turns out that the world isn't fair, and our structures and our social systems very often discriminate against particular individuals and groups of people. That's the way the world is, because people have been greedy, and because we haven't spread the gospel as we should. The sin has embedded itself in institutions, put itself into the social structures, and we have to be aware of that. It means that it is not enough just to say, well, I'm going to help other people. It's not even just enough to try to help people who are suffering in some ways because of the unjust social structures. A full Christianity is going to have to be concerned with the structures themselves, with trying to overcome those, with trying to find the contradictions that exist right within our own society, and trying to do something about Christianizing all of that. It's probably not enough just to say, well, the people who work for large corporations or who are in the government are nice people, and end up trying to help others, and very often that is the case. The problem is very often the system does not allow others to break out. I mean, what about the black young people in our ghettos today with such a high rate of unemployment, and even if they want to try to break out of that, how do they end up doing it? What about the way old people are treated in our society, where they're sent off to the nursing homes, and very often no one visits them, and the whole concept of the extended family is not operative anymore. Here is a systematic problem that requires other kinds of solutions than just goodwill on the part of individuals. So the social character of sin is something that we need to keep in mind. Now, if we are going to go further than that, we have to continue our analysis and try to make it somehow more concrete for ourselves. Otherwise, the critics are going to be able to come back at us that we don't do anything in all this matter. One of the dialogues that goes on is with the Marxists. Now, the Marxists say that they've got concrete ways of making the world better. They say that through the revolution of the proletariat and the overturning of the capitalistic system, that things can be changed. It's no wonder that Marxism has made such an impact on our world today, and is such a strong force in Latin America today, where there is so much injustice. Now, we Christians have to somehow be practical and have concrete programs in the way that the Marxists do. One of the important dialogue that's gone on in our own century is between the Christians and the Marxists, and they force us to rethink things. Part of our liberation theology, so-called, or the theology of hope, has grown out of this dialogue with the Marxists. Its European version, it stresses a lot of the biblical injunctions that really God is one who calls upon us to eradicate injustice, that no structure is final, that God has promised us a final fulfillment, that we must work to bring that coming of the kingdom about. all of those themes. But in Latin America, it has taken a different turn, where people are more concerned with the pressing problems of the poor. And very often, these people uncover the contradictions that exist right within their own situation. I remember talking to a sister, a very brave woman who was working down in Brazil and was just helping to organize small groups where they would come together and talk about their problems and try to do so in the light of the gospel. I mean, it is the terrible risk the woman took in doing that, and the stories we hear about how nervous government people become just because people gather and discuss their problems and what they might do about them under the heading of the Christian faith in some way. It's a very scary thing, because that begins the process of changing things, of calling upon people to make adjustments. So I'm talking about this. I recall the CFM groups of the past that I was connected with, and so often in the 60s, spent so much time in those meetings. One of the great things about those meetings was that the priest wasn't allowed to talk. You could just sit there and listen, and I'll tell you, for once I think I did listen, and I learned so much from those people. But those CFM groups were built on that thing of observe, judge, and act. The people that were in those groups were concerned about what was going on in their community, and they did things to better the situation. I can't help contrasting those groups with so many of the prayer groups today, where people come together and pray and call upon the Spirit and so on, but it so often stays within the group. I keep wondering, where's the outreach? Where's the desire to try to change the world in some way? And those CFM groups really had something to offer, I think, that observe, judge, and act. That observing of what the contradictions in the society and in our own church are. That part of it is becoming aware of the fact that people are suffering. And not, what was it, Michael Harrington wrote the book about the invisible poor. The people who we don't even see or notice around us who are suffering. We have to see what the unjust structures are. We have to notice that in the church as well. We have to be willing to critique ourselves when we are involved in treating people badly, and when we are not doing the job of trying to inculcate a sense of social justice. And then there's the business of judging. We have to make judgments about what is going on. For us Christians, the cross must remain the judge of the flag. We are the people who say we have a higher vantage point from which to look upon what is going on in our own country. We're the ones who are able to say that, well, we're spending too much for defense. Why couldn't we spend more on helping poor people? We're the ones who can say our country needs to be in the forefront of trying to help the people who are starving in our world. We're the ones that have to follow the dictums of our Pope in trying to help the developing countries and so on. But the cross is judge of the flag. We have this higher vantage point. This says that we must be the followers of the Lord Jesus, who came to liberate people. We must realize that Christianity is not tied to one economic system. It is not tied to capitalism. It's not the only way of organizing economic life. And very often people seem to think that way, that capitalism is somehow intrinsically Christian, and of course that isn't true. And there are other economic approaches that good Christians could follow. And then there is the act. We have to do something. We have to make sure that we are part of the solution and not part of the problem. I think very often in our parish, when we try to preach on social justice matters, we try to give the people a number of options. Try to say, well, write your congressman, or join Bread for the World, or try to help people in our own local community. Try to give many options. But most of all, I think what we have to remember, if we're going to take all of that seriously, is what the Lord Jesus said and what we read in Matthew 25, where it says, I was hungry, I was thirsty, did you help me or didn't you? It doesn't say, well, you're going to get to heaven based on whether you went to church or not, or whether you said your prayers or not. It's got that strong and striking statement, I was imprisoned, I was hungry, I was thirsty, and did you help me or not? And that really is a challenging kind of statement for all of us.
All rights to this talk are reserved by St. Anthony Messenger Press. 1615 Republic Street, Cincinnati, Ohio, 45210. This series of talks, An American Spirituality for the 80s, was recorded live by St. Anthony Messenger Press. The speaker is Father James J. Basic.
A contemporary spirituality should be characterized by a reflective spontaneity, a sort of thoughtful letting go. If we're going to be effective people in the decade ahead, we have to somehow combine in our lives self-awareness with self-forgetfulness. In the midst of a world in which we are often excessively worried about ourselves, we're going to have to learn to be self-forgetful. And in a world in which we are often busy and involved in the rat race of life, we're going to have to find a way to be reflective and self-aware. Now, it seems to me that we're fighting two extremes here. First of all is the preoccupation with self. This is when we are too worried about what is going on within ourselves, an excessive kind of introspection. It seems as though the world in which we live has fostered that kind of notion. There's been an American sense in which is very introspective. It seems that foreigners often notice that about us, that we tend to turn in, that we're always examining our motives, that we want to know if we're really as good as we think we are, that we want to make sure that we're free of all guilt. We often look strange to people from other cultures in that regard, this excessive turning in on ourselves and examination of our motives. It seems in our culture that in the recent past this has been really intensified in many ways. There's a book called The Culture of Narcissism. That phrase is very telling. The narcissistic spirit, where we are concerned always about our own image, looking at ourselves, and in which we get carried away with that, where we're unable to look out to others or see larger concerns. Really, the question of guilt has continued to plague us. I remember giving a sermon on Mother's Day, and in that sermon I was talking about motherhood in an ideal sense. I thought I was talking realistically in some ways about the struggles of motherhood and so on, but I was also speaking about the ideal of what a mother should be like, caring for the children and trying to be patient and a good example and so on. And I remember one woman coming up to me afterwards, extremely distraught by what I said. And she said to me, "Don't you see what you were doing to us?" Speaking, I guess, for the mothers present. She says, "I was sitting there dripping in guilt. I was feeling all the time that I don't measure up to those high ideals that you were setting there." Now, that made me think again about the way that we can be so preoccupied with ourselves and our own guilt feelings. I almost feel as though, despite many of the advances we have made, that we are still plagued by neurotic kind of guilt feelings. I have that image sometime of guilt being like a black cloud that is over our heads, and that all we need is some little trigger, and that cloud descends on us and sort of engulfs us and gives us that depressed and down feeling. There's another way in which the problem occurs to me, and that is the way we use our leisure time. It seems that very often people cannot even use leisure constructively, that when we want to stop our routine and go about trying to recreate ourselves or do something fun or just have a good time and so on, that people often end up even being preoccupied with self on those occasions, sort of can't get spontaneous, can't get with it at that time. I think of people who go to basketball games and sit there and worried whether they're going to have a heart attack during the game. Or people who go out to play bridge and are too concerned about what other people think about their bridge playing. Or people who go to parties and think, that they have to impress others. That all is a matter, really, of a preoccupation with self. overly concerned, not able to get our mind off of who we are, or what kind of impression we're making, or what kind of an image we're portraying to other people. The culture of narcissism, preoccupation with self. I think that probably we all find ourselves at times caught up in that, where we would just like to leave ourself behind, where we'd like to quit thinking for a while. We were talking to a girl who was having a lot of emotional problems, and she just wanted to sleep so she could get away from herself, so she could just stop thinking about herself. I know people very often who want to commit suicide will talk in that way. Just to be able to quit having this terrible anxiety that is plaguing them. Now, the other kind of problem we have is living without any thinking or reflection. This is when we're involved in the rat race of life, where it seems that we're just going round and round, where there's never any time for ourselves, when our energies are constantly being used up on our jobs or the responsibilities that we have to meet. There seems to be no time to stop and think, well, what's it all about? People who are serious about the spiritual life seem to have trouble to find just 15 minutes in a day to do any reflection. Some people tell me they can't even find 5 minutes out of a busy day to stop and meditate. People feel very often on the go all the time. The holiday season often seems to intensify that. And people's jobs. It's even despite the fact we've made so much progress in labor-saving devices, as shorter work weeks and so on, we don't find people saying, oh yeah, it's great because now I have a lot of time to think or to read or to study my Bible or go to classes or to improve myself or to do a retreat or anything. People don't seem to have that reaction. Very often it's, no, I'm caught up in a rat race. Don't ask me to do anything. I'm too busy. I really don't have time. I don't know where the days go. I'm at loose ends. I feel like I'm hanging by a thread. And I just don't have time to really do anything constructive on my inner life. It seems for many people that the law of diminishing returns take over. People get more and more fatigued, and then they can't work as well, and they get further and further behind. I guess I'm in tune with that with students. Very often as quarters come to the end, I find students just are putting in more and more hours on the books with less and less results. I often think if they would stop and sleep for a while, get a nap or have a good night's sleep, they would do much better. Or if they had some sort of regular routine in their life, they might end up having more energy to do the things they're supposed to do. And so the frenzy of modern life, sometimes wonder, what are we doing in all of this? I've talked to some people who have just quit high-pressure jobs and done simpler things and gone off for a while, just taken off work for a while, gone and done other things, and they feel so much different. I think of the times when I lived in New York City that had that whole sense of pace. After a while, after living there, you're just walking around fast like everybody else, moving fast. Everything's in a rush. And you're caught up in that frenzy, and you don't even know you're doing it till you leave there. I remember leaving New York City and going and being in a country parish for a while, and just the stark contrast was the first time that I ever realized how caught up I was in the rat race while I was living in New York. Well, that's probably an extreme example, but I think all of us could look at our lives and see how busy we are and how we let busyness take us over and don't really find the time for quiet, for meditation, to reflect on the deeper things of life. Now, if you feel any of that, if any of that is real to you, either the business of preoccupation with self or this business of being involved in the rat race of life, then we understand this need that I'm talking about for a reflective spontaneity, for a proper combination of self-forgetfulness and self-awareness. Well, let me try to describe both of those things. First of all, the spontaneity. It seems that we are really at our best when we're immersed in what we do and when we forget ourselves. One of the great moments in life is we're really not aware of what we're doing at all. We're just doing it. We feel integrated in doing it. I think about times when we're serving others, when we're actually genuinely concerned about another human being, and we're trying to reach out to them, trying to help them. No need to impress them. No need to pile up points or anything. Just, I got to help you now. I'm going to try to listen to you. I'm going to try to reach out. I'm going to try to help you in your concrete needs and so on. Then, very often afterwards, we stop and think, boy, I felt good then. We're not even thinking we feel good at the time. It's only later on we said, I was at my best then. I think that part of this is being able to be immersed in the now, living in the present moment. So often we are plagued by this anxiety about the future or guilt feelings about the past. And what happens? We cannot mine the riches of the moment. We can't be present to what is going on. You notice how in simple things that occurs. You might shake hands with somebody, and while you're shaking hands with them, they're looking off in another direction or waiting for the next person that they're trying to meet. No attention at all to the now, to this present moment, to what is going on. When I think about this being immersed in the now, I can't help thinking about the Buddhist parable. You remember the one about that the Buddha told about the man who was being chased by the tigers, and he's running along, and he jumps over a cliff hanging on a vine. And the tiger's up there sniffing away, and he looks down, and there's a long drop, and down below there's another tiger waiting to devour him if he drops down. And while he's hanging there, he looks up and he sees these two mice up near the top of his vine. They are gnawing away at his vine. Well, just then, the man spots a strawberry nearby, growing out of the rocks. He reaches over, plucks the strawberry, puts it in his mouth, and says, "How good it tastes." End of Buddhist parable. I often say that, really, if there was ever a man who overcame his anxiety about the future and his upset over the past that had just occurred to him and enjoyed the moment, it was that fellow. He did the one thing he could do. He enjoyed that strawberry, how sweet it tasted. And that always struck me as a representative of the attitude that we need to develop if we're going to live spontaneously in a self-forgetful way. That is, immersed in the now, doing what is at hand. Another way of saying that, perhaps, is to say that we need to act wholeheartedly. We have to have our head and heart together in what we're doing. Do you ever notice how fatigued you get when you're doing something you don't like? How fatiguing it is to be blocking on an emotion, for example, to be angry but not able to admit your anger, and to be putting all one's energy into holding it in. You get very tired in those situations. To be doing a job that you can't stand. You're saying all the time, you think, I wish I didn't have to do this. I wish I wasn't around here. And boy, we get mighty weary in that. We might contrast that with the other situation when we like our work, when we're happy with what we're doing. Time passes rapidly then. We are not thinking about ourselves or our own struggles. We simply are enjoying what we are doing. We are being wholehearted about it. Someone once wrote that the problem for many of us modern people is that we don't really want what we want. That is, we don't really get passionate about the things that we're involved in life. We live half-heartedly. And the secret seems to be to overcome that and to live wholeheartedly, immersed in the now, mining the riches of the present moment. That really is a New Testament insight as well, isn't it? Jesus talked about do it now, let the dead bury the dead, follow me now. There's an immediacy about some of the gospel passages. Don't wait around. Decide now. This is the moment of decision. The New Testament talks about the kairos, the proper time, the moment for deciding to do the will of God. One part of living spontaneously, I think, is to learn to follow our own rhythms in life, to try to determine how our spiritual life fits in with our natural way of doing things. Let's just take the example of prayer. Some people might try to pray at times when they don't feel like it. They're going about their business and they think, oh, I got to pray now. It's right before I go to bed. But that happens to be the time when they're most sleepy, when they can't really gather. So they're sitting there struggling to try to say their prayers before they go to bed and getting nowhere. Whereas maybe the way to go about that is to try to find the time when we're most likely to pray well. Find the time when we're most awake, when we most feel the need of God, and make that our prayer time. Same thing goes with finding the frequency of things in our lives. Maybe the frequency of making a retreat, for example. One would have to try to determine in one's life how often I need to do that to really function effectively as a Christian person. Some of what we're going to find out when we try to discover our own rhythms is that many of them we're not in touch with. We don't even know when we pray best, or how we treat people in the best way, or when we should get involved in church activities, or how much time we should devote to civic things. We have never developed the sense of how much energy we have or how we could best expend it. So one of the first things is to get in touch with our own rhythms, to begin to recognize them. I often encourage people to experiment with that. Try out different times of praying, for example. Try out different forms of social service to others to find which ones you like. There's no sense in doing something you don't really feel like doing. I remember a guy years ago came to me and says, Father, I got a real problem. I want to be involved, and I'm trying to figure out whether I should be on this church committee or whether I should coach the Little League team. And I said to him, well, what do you really want to do? Where do your interests and talents lie? He says, well, there's no doubt. He says, I could really help those kids playing ball. I would be a good coach. I love kids. I would be interested in it and so on. But somehow maybe I would feel guilty if I did that, and I think I should be involved in this church committee. And I encourage the man to follow his instincts, his intuition, to coach the Little League team. That was his form of service, and I think it was so much better for him. He didn't feel fatigued doing that. He was energized in doing it. He felt good about it. He was really making a contribution. So he learned something about himself, about where his talents were, and used those to make his contribution to trying to help other people out. Far better off than if he would go to the church committee meetings and be upset and feel it was a drag and get discouraged and all of that. So part of what I think we need to do is learn what our rhythms are. But then we also have to figure out which ones are constructive and which aren't, which are destructive. We have to be aware of that as well. For example, someone might say, well, I'm not going to program any penance in my life. I will wait till I feel like fasting, or that I feel like giving alms, or doing some of the other special works in my life. I will wait till those times come. But maybe they don't come. Or maybe someone finds, well, if I let myself go like that, I just get undisciplined. I just drift along. And so the person would have to then try to correct that kind of bad rhythm or bad natural instinct in her own life. Other rhythms we would find out work well. Maybe by following them that I end up being really living a good life. And I find out that, well, I can just trust myself in dealing with people who I don't like. No, I just respond well to them. I don't yell at them. I gear myself down. I am very tolerant of them, and I'm usually civil to them, and I can trust that kind of natural reaction on my part. I don't have to do anything else with it. Just live it out. Let it go. As the young people say, go with the flow. And that seems to work well. Well, I've mixed up a few ideas there, but I don't want to get away from the essential point that I'm trying to make. There is a way of living in spontaneous fashion, in a self-forgetful way. And that seems to be the healthy thing to do in life. The thing that we want to do as Christians is to become good people and then let it flow. If we're on the right track, it seems we can trust our intuitions. We can trust our natural reactions to things. We can feel that, yes, I will live in a Christian manner. I don't have to be checking myself all the time. I don't have to be wondering. Don't have to be checking my motivations. I can just let that go. I think very often we get hung up on this question of motivation. It's part maybe of that American cultural heritage where we've got to check ourselves out, be ultra sure that we are not involved in guilt, that we're very pure and high-minded and so on. We have to be the highest and best of people because we are the chosen people. And very often our religious backgrounds maybe have made us feel that same way, that I have to be this perfect kind of individual. Therefore, I have to get rid of any semblance of poor motivation in my life. Well, I feel that very often that's destructive. I try to tell people, hey, if you're doing a good job, you're meeting your responsibilities, then don't worry if your motives are perfectly pure, because they probably aren't going to be anyway. Motives are always mixed. There's always going to be a bit of selfishness in what we do. We're always going to have a bit of our own concerns in it. But my theory is, why worry about that? As long as the overall result is good, as long as there is also a motivation of love and charity and concern for others. I think we just tie ourselves up in a knot very often. I'm talking about good people now who take the spiritual life seriously. No need to be checking out the motivations all the time. So, back to it, self-forgetful, living in the moment, allowing it to flow. Now, on the other hand, we have to be self-aware. We have to have our times when we think about what it is going on in our lives, who we are and where we fit. We need we can't allow ourselves just to be caught up in this rat race, because we will lose our effectiveness after a while. We'll forget what we're all about. We'll lose that Christian spirit we should have. We'll lose our energy. We'll be part of the problem of the burnt out cases, people who have no longer anything to give to others. So if we're going to be serious about the spiritual life, we have to find our times to stop and think it over, pause to meditate, get our heads straight, refocus our attention, recall what our life is all about. Now, that means things like perhaps an annual retreat, building that into our lives, or daily meditation at the other extreme, that 5 minutes a day or 15 minutes when we reflect on our relationship with God, when we just maybe try to be silently present to God. Maybe it's a time for spiritual reading where we read a little bit and then stop and just reflect on what we've read. Stopping to read our Bibles, finding a verse that intrigues us, that we can mull over and make part of ourselves. But we need that quiet time. Silence has to be part of our lives. We can't be busy all the time. We simply will no longer be effective. I mean, how many mothers have I talked to who say, I am impatient. That's my major problem. And very often when I ask them, the reason they're impatient is because they're fatigued, because they're tired, because they're in there with those kids all day long who are pulling at them and competing for their attention. And maybe what that woman needs is to get away for a while, just to get out of the house, just to do something different for a while. Sometimes I tell them, well, lock yourself in the bathroom if you can't get anyplace else, just to get away from the situation. But we need to find it. Maybe people find it driving to work or being out in the car or walking someplace. And we should walk more, give ourselves the chance to think as we go along. Then, the question for us to decide is, how much of that do I need to be effective? Most of us can't spend 10 hours a day in prayer. Most of us can't even manage like a monthly retreat or day of recollection. Maybe some people even find it hard to find the 15 minutes a day. But what we have to find out for ourselves is how often we need to do it so that we continually grow in our spiritual life. So it doesn't just become routine and formal on one hand, or on the other hand that we don't do it often enough so we just go downhill. Find our own frequency. Again, that's the point I alluded to before. The frequency of confession is probably a telling point here. It used to be people said, well, you should go every month, and it was almost like an unwritten rule somehow, go once a month. Now what I think one of the healthy developments that we're seeing today is that people are beginning to decide this for themselves. They have to figure out how often does me good. Should I go once a year, once every couple years? Shall I go every week or whatever? And how do I make that judgment? I have to see whether it is working pragmatically or not. Am I advancing going this often? I find a lot of people, good people, experimenting with this. Maybe they wait for a year just to see what happens. I've had some people tell me, well, now I've got to go back to 6 months. I found out that was too long. And before long, they're going to find their own rhythm. And maybe they'll need to keep adjusting it, but then it will be their own. It won't be imposed by somebody from without. So we need to be self-aware. We try to be self-aware in order that we can live more spontaneously. The two things don't just sit there side by side. It's not like I'm spontaneous on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday and reflective on Thursday. That's not the way these things need to be put together. We are going to get this properly reflective spirituality, this reflective spontaneity, only by seeing how the two things go together. So I do my reflection in order that I can return to the world and be more involved in it. No, I have to set aside my time so I can live more effectively. I think now that the quiet time, the meditation, is for the sake of constructive action in our world. Now, there are people who have the opposite spirituality. That is, their real life is in meditation. Those are people who live in monasteries, monks, whose really life work is to be praying. They must work at cultivating the spiritual life. But for most of us, we are active. We are involved. Probably for most of us, the way we sense the problem is we're too busy. Don't have enough time. We're in the rat race. And we have responsibilities. We couldn't get out of them if we wanted to. So we have to find our reflection time, get our silence in so that we can function more effectively in our modern world. Now, there's some people who are going to be plagued by this, and when they start thinking, they're going to think too much. I think of a young lady who came to me who was excessively involved in this search for self, excessively introspective. She was always analyzing her motives to the place where it began to paralyze her. And what I told her was, what I think you should do when you start to wonder about things like that, bracket it. What I mean, write it down on a piece of paper and say, I'm not going to think about it now. I will save that for once a week. I'll go talk to my spiritual director and I'll bring up this problem. If it comes to my mind again during the week, I'll check it and say it's a second time. But I won't let myself think about it. Then I will bring it to this 1 hour. And during that 1 hour with the spiritual director, then you can bring it out. Then you can talk about it objectively. Get it out in the open. Get some advice on how to deal with it. Then put it aside and try to return to the world of spontaneous living. Again, the theory is that we are we are meditating for the sake of constructive action. If we are really going to be Christian people in the world, we're going to make a difference, we're going to bring the dimension of faith to others, give hope to other people who badly need it, it will grow out of a rich inner life. It will be because we are aware of the presence of the Lord within us, that the Spirit is the one that's energizing us. If we've got that straight, then we are going to be able to go out to others and to try to spread the good news. Then we will have something to contribute. Then we'll be able to care for those people who are put in our own responsibility, the ones that God has given us. Yes, we need a reflective spontaneity, a wholeheartedness about life that grows out of a rich inner life.
All rights to this talk are reserved by St. Anthony Messenger Press, 1615 Republic Street, Cincinnati, Ohio, 45210.